Welcome everybody to our panel on political consultants and datafication in India. Thank you for joining us. I will introduce our panelists in a second. We have a wonderful group of panelists who have detailed knowledge of the topic that we have at hand today. But before I do that, I wanted to just sort of briefly introduce the topic. Talk a little bit about why it is important, interesting, and put India in the context of how this works in other countries. Then I'll hand it over to the panelists. And I'll introduce the panelists one by one. We have with us Amogh, Dhar, Sharma, Shivam, Shankar, Singh, and Ruchi, Gupta. And as I'll talk more about them as I introduce them. So let me just share my screen for a second, just by way of small. You're all able to see my screen? Okay, so it's just a single slide. So I'm not giving any presentation here. It looks like, unfortunately, a bunch of other stuff hit at the top of my slide that didn't go away. But what I wanted to do was to just sort of talk about three basic points as we think about how professionalization, data, political consultants have changed the game in India, as we think about what is happening in India in a broader international context. So 3 points I want to talk about are, the extent to which this is done in other democracies, especially long-standing democracies. The extent to which we're seeing quantification, the use of quantitative data, and adaptation. Whatever methods had been used in other countries, how does it have to change, or how has it changed when it's come to the Indian context? So the first thing I want to say is, this is actually a fairly common role in long-standing consolidated democracies. There are a number of well-known political consultants in history, professional campaign managers, often very, very controversial names. So people who know US politics well, a guy like Lee Atwater, who designed Republican campaigns around the black-white divide in the South, right? Now, initially, professional campaign management was focused around developing larger campaign messages, trying to sort of divine what the population might respond to. A lot of the work was focused on trying to understand were there ideological or emotional appeals that would be particularly effective when sort of trying to reach the population. In recent years, I would say probably in the last decade and a half, you have seen a massive amount of quote unquote quantification in electoral campaigns across the world. It isn't just in India, but India is one of the most stark examples of it happening. It has taken, it's really the introduction of a lot of capital, industry, and academics sort of coming in and working on campaigns. And we see today a larger role for surveys, numbers, statistical analysis to bolster the, what I've written here is the precision of the campaign. And the way to think about what these, what quantification is trying to do, the biggest gains have been made in something called micro-targeting. The logic of micro-targeting is that you look for a particular set of subgroups that you can encourage to turn out that are most likely to support your party, right? Now, basically what is happening is that we're trying to understand, when you do micro-targeting, the probability of an individual voting for my party. Now, if it just stopped there, that would be trying to predict an election, right? That's the kind of stuff that, let's say, like a C voter does or a Lokniti does, right? But often what these professional campaigns are trying to do is not just understand the probability of somebody supporting my party, but trying to understand the probability of somebody voting for my party under a bunch of different scenarios. If I run a campaign this way, if I run a campaign that way, if I run a campaign that way, under this set of candidates, under that set of candidates. So one sort of technical way of thinking of what consultants are supposed to do is that they're supposed to maximize the probability of people voting for you across the population, given the set of options and candidates available to them, right? It's often not been stated in that way, but on a technical level, once things have been quantified, that's sort of what it becomes. The third thing I want to talk about is adaptation, right? So in a number of settings, as I said, we do see political consultants, we do see professionalization of campaigns. These can be systems that are very ideological, that have, relatively low levels of defection, what I call sort of strong party attachment, right? India has weak party attachment, right? We have a lot of legislators that jump ship from one side to the next, from one party to the next. We have, wholesale cadders moving from one party to the other. And that's not something that you see in most consolidated democracies, right? And so in some sense, the focus of professionalization has changed a lot in India. So if you look at political consultancies around the world, the vast majority of political consultancies are focused on working on individual campaigns, even when they're primaries, right? So they'll work on individual candidates' campaigns in primaries, which are electing the candidate for a constituency. Whichever one wins, then the other professionals come over to the winning candidate, and so on and so forth, right? In India, obviously, because there's less sort of filiality between candidates and parties, and ticket selection is done in a more centralized manner, professionalization does not take on this sort of aspect, right? So there are ways in which professionalization has adapted to the way that parties work in India, also obviously to the way that voters vote, and I think our speakers will have a lot to say about that. But this is just a way of sort of thinking about how the kind of professionalization, the use of political consultants and quantitative data have emerged in the Indian system, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and move it over to our speakers. I want to say that we have, as we go through these presentations, if you have any questions, Q&A, we have a Q&A box down here. So I'll ask that you put the questions in the box, and I will read them out to the panelists, and I'll try to make sure that everything is covered properly. Okay. So our first speaker today is Amogh Sharma. Amogh's research interests focus on democratic politics of the global South, with an emphasis on party politics, political communication, and the political economy of development in South Asia. Last year, he finished his DPhil in international development at Oxford. Congratulations. Examining the professionalization of politics. And we're going to talk about many things that we've talked about: growing influence of party staffers, political consultants, spin doctors, pollsters, intra-party politics. He is an ESRC postdoctoral fellow, and now moving to another major topic, trying to understand the problem of disinformation and propaganda. um, in India. So Amogh, please take it away.
Thanks a lot. So let me begin by thanking all the organizers for inviting me to this panel and to everyone who registered for the event. I thought that in the time that I have for my opening remarks today, what I will do is that I will try to unpack how the expansion of the industry of political consulting has taken off in India. And I will focus in on particularly on how and when this industry really takes off and emerges and what factors I think are behind its emergence. Now, before I put forward my own argument and my own thoughts on the matter, I thought I could begin by talking about two common myths, or maybe I can call them two common assumptions that I've often seen floating around as to why political consultants have suddenly come in demand in India. And I've seen these floating around both in academic circles as well as in everyday public opinion. The first of these foundational myths, I think, has to do with the role of technology. And this is an idea that somehow political consultants are rising, the demand for them is rising because of the growing technological sophistication of the world we're living in. The argument here goes something like this, that to run an election campaign in today's world, you need command over digital media, you need command over big data analytics, you need command over hashtag wars to win elections, which cannot be found within the party because these techniques are quite sophisticated. Hence, the argument runs that inevitably parties have had to outsource certain tasks to these consultants, and hence the demand has emerged. Now, I think, of course, there's a kernel of truth in this idea. It cannot be denied that India has seen an explosion of technology in its election campaigns in certain quite obvious ways. But I do think that this role of technology often gets easily exaggerated. And this is because if any of you have ever had the chance to meet an IPAC employee, IPAC is Prashant Kishore's famous political consulting firm. If you've ever met an IPAC employee and spoken to them about what kind of work they do, very quickly you will realize that running social media campaigns, running hashtag wars is really a very minuscule fraction of the work that they do on a day-to-day basis. So if you look back to the 2017 campaign, which I was studying for my research, where Prashant Kishore was working in Punjab and UP for the Congress Party, if you look at some of the campaign events he had devised, such as Coffee with Captain in Punjab, or Kisan Mang Patra that he had launched, and the huge Kisan rally that he had organized, there was really no technological sophistication to speak of that I believe could not be sourced from within the party cadres or within a few handful of people within the party. The second thing I think we need to be doubtful of exaggerating the role of technology is that if you look at the post-poll survey data from CSDS Lokniti, you find that the percentage of voters who claim that they were contacted by a politician, let's say through an SMS, through a WhatsApp message, through a pre-recorded voice call, is the number of people who respond yes to this question ranges between 10 to 20%. Similarly, when in the CSDS Lokniti post-poll survey, they ask voters, do you have a Facebook account? Do you have a Twitter account? Again, the figures are quite marginal. So despite the hype of India's first social media election, India's first WhatsApp election, I think we need to understand that high-tech campaigns are not the be-all and end-all of political consultants in India. The second assumption and second myth that I often see floating around has to do with the belief that political consultants are needed in India today because political parties today are effectively dead in organizational terms. The belief here appears to be that political consultants are needed and the manpower there is needed because India's political parties have weak organizational structures, they have demobilized party cadres, and they have limited grassroots presence. Now, the reason I find this this causal link unconvincing is again because of two factors. First of which is the fact that the fact remains that both weakly organized parties, such as the Congress, as well as strongly organized parties, such as the BJP, have relied on the services of a political consultant like Prashant Kishore. Thus, at a purely correlational level, I think we cannot make a clear argument about the organizational strength of a party and the proclivity of the party to rely on a political consultant. The second reason I remain a little unconvinced is that I do not think party organization, the weakness of party organization is a sufficient condition, because if it were a sufficient condition, we would have expected that political consultants would have emerged in India as early as the 1970s when Mrs. Indira Gandhi deinstitutionalized the Congress party and hollowed its organizational strength. Of course, we know that did not happen. Political consultants did not emerge in the 70s and 80s. They're a much more recent phenomena. So I think any explanation of why political consultants are emerging in India has to be mindful of the fact of the timing of their emergence. So let me talk a bit more about the timing and the time that I have left today. The appearance of Prashant Kishore in Modi's 2014 campaign is, of course, the big bag movement when political consultants emerge. But I do think that a focus on Prashant Kishore often obscures the fact that he is quite an exceptional figure in how the industry of political consultants work in India. And in the Q&A, I can talk a bit more about it. Based on my own research, I have found that much before Prashant Kishore emerged on the scene, political consultants, some of the first ones, had already emerged as early as 2003 and 2004. Many of them had been working for quite a few years, and many of them eventually sort of closed shop. But let's not be in any doubt that much before PK arrived on the scene, this industry had already taken root in India. So the question to my mind that then emerges is that why is it? What is it about the 2000s as a decade in Indian politics that is unique, that legislators in India start turning to political consultants? And why is it no sooner and no later than that? And here I want to put forward three arguments. The first factor, and this is the most important one, and I must thank Neelanjan, who has written quite a lot about this. The first factor is that Neelanjan has brought to our attention that over the last 2 decades, a dominant trend has emerged in Indian politics and has only gotten stronger, which is that parties distribute tickets not to those candidates who they feel can best represent the voters in a particular constituency, but tickets are handed to those candidates who are seen to be more winnable, quote unquote. And here, winnability is defined as the ability of a candidate to be wealthy and their ability to self-finance their campaign. Now, why is this important when it comes to political consultants? I think it's important because in a situation where candidates have quite literally been parachuted in the constituency and where they have not invested in building up a mass base, they effectively have a very poor understanding of the voters. And here, political consultants can provide a very quick and dirty technique of voter profiling, about image building, about narrowcasting that Neelanjan was talking about earlier, which comes in handy. The second factor, which is quite interesting about Indian politics in the 2000s, and this again has been quite well documented by this point, is the fact that the average MP and MLA in India at this point has increasingly large pockets and large amounts of wealth at their disposal. And this point is relevant for our present discussion because this means that some of the first MPs and MLAs who are hiring the services of political consultants in the early 2000s didn't always necessarily believe that consultants will magically help them win elections. But what it meant was that they certainly had enough wealth at their disposal that they could experiment with them without really making a big dent in the campaign expenditure, right? They weren't burning a hole in their pocket by hiring these consultants. And the wealth and the financialization of India's election campaigns is quite critical to this point. The third factor, and this is something that I have found in my own research, is that some of the first MPs and MLAs who were hiring a political consultant in India belong to the younger generation of dynasts from political families. Now, why is this important? I think this is important because many of these younger political dynasts had been educated and they studied for their undergrad and often for their masters in US and UK universities, where they had some sort of exposure to the presence of political consultants in the presidential campaigns in the United States. So it should not come as a big surprise that when these younger dynasts return to India and start fighting the first elections in the 2000s, they are the ones who are the most receptive to the idea of using a political consultant. And of course, I can't name here because of concerns of anonymity that are promised to some of my informants, but it's really, the demand really picks up from this younger generation of Indian MPs and MLAs. So I think it's the confluence of these three factors that really help us understand about what is unique about the 2000s as a period in Indian politics, that the industry takes root and then of course expands, and Prashant Kishore emerges on this scene. This is why political consultants have been able to carve out a niche for themselves. Now, one final point I will make before I end is that is another reason why I think 2000s as a movement is important to understand the industry of political consulting in India. And here I wish to wear my hat as a political anthropologist rather than a traditional political scientist, which is the fact that I think in the literature we often think too much about why is it that parties and politicians are demanding the services of a political consultant. I think equally we need to be thinking about and we need to be discussing why are people joining this industry? Why is it that scores of young people these days want to join as political consultants? And of course, Shivam will speak in a minute, and if you've had the chance to read his really fascinating book, you get one answer to that question. And I think here again, there's something about the post-liberalization era in India's economy and the enterprise culture and the wave of entrepreneurialism that's in the air in the 2000s that encourages some of the earliest political consultants to start up their own firms in this domain. And what they bring to the table is a very technocratic disposition to managing politics, to think about politics even in discrete terms of quantitative data, in terms of technocratic expertise. And this is precisely the moment when this industry then starts taking off. So in addition to thinking about why parties are demanding the services of political consultants, I think let's also start talking about who are these people, why are they joining this industry, and why are they engaging with politics in a certain way. Right. So Neelanjan, I'll end there. I think I've used up my 7 minutes.
Thank you, Amogh, and thank you for being really squarely on time to keep us going. It's a great way to start off the panel. I think provides a lot of context for what we're seeing in India. Our next speaker is Shivam Shankar Singh, who headed data analytics and campaigns for the BJP for Manipur and Tripura under the guidance of, at that time, party's National General Secretary, Ram Madhav. He's been a senior research fellow at India Foundation and briefly worked with Prashant Kishore's company IPAC during the Punjab campaign. He's also been a LAMP fellow and graduated from the University of Michigan with a BSc in economics. You will know, we've already made mention of it. His first book was entitled How to Win an Indian Election What Political Parties Don't Want You to Know. And his second book is entitled The Art of Conjuring Alternate Realities, Looking into the Operations of Political Parties, Cyber Criminals, Godmen, and Nation States, Intelligence Agencies from around the world. He is someone who has, obviously worked on the set of issues that we are discussing today and written about it extensively. Thank you for joining us, Shivam.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to CPR and TCPD for organizing this excellent event. I think it's an extremely relevant topic to talk about. Why are there so many political consultants? Why has politics become so professional? And what data is being used and how it's being used? It's especially important in the context that for most of people, politics is about politicians. It's not about these professionals coming into politics, charging money. And politics transforms in a lot of different ways when this starts to happen, because your resource base, who you can work with, what kind of staff teams that you can hire actually starts mattering and impacting the election results. So I'd actually like to start by just explaining what is it that political consultants do, and even more basically, what is an election campaign all about? What are the steps to it? So I am quickly going to share my screen. Let me know if this doesn't work. Screen share is working, right? So broadly, if you look at election campaigns, then they break up into these 5 distinct steps. On-ground intelligence and strategy building, which is essentially your components of surveys, your focus group discussions, all the input that you get from the ground to actually build a campaign. The second part is ground cadre building, which is where you're trying to activate the party machinery, you're trying to reach to the booth level. So people who are part of the party network can actually get the messages that the party wants, can actually be activated. Are they doing the job that the central party command wants them to do or not? And that can be tracked. The third component of it is building a volunteer network, which is essentially people who are not directly affiliated with a political party, but become your supporters, say, on a specific issue, or become your supporters based on a very niche cause or a very niche community group. If you look at, say, the India Against Corruption movement, then that's an excellent example of a volunteer network that ultimately helped a political party. As Amogh mentioned, the Punjab elections, then we organized these events called Halke Which Captain, which was essentially a meeting with Captain Amrinder Singh, where people gave in their petitions about what their basic problems were. So essentially a volunteer network was created who could organize these events, who could go out and call people to these events and inform people that their problems will be solved in the first 100 days of the government get informed. A lot of the volunteer networks are actually youth networks, women's networks, and very specific entities like that. Social media and communication strategy is the fourth component. Also, as Amogh mentioned, just one of the 5 major things. Very important one, because social media is ultimately very important in the sense that it does shape communication and it does shape the conversation that people are having. Amogh's right in the sense that very few people are actively on social media and actively receiving the party's message from the party itself. But the way that elections have transformed in the last decade or so, even if you're not on social media, you get the same arguments. We actually analyzed this in a couple of Indian villages, and ultimately the arguments that people received on their smartphone were the arguments that they used in general conversation when talking to other people in their villages. So the extent and reach is much beyond just social media, and that is why, say, English media in the country is so important. If you look at the raw numbers, then 3 to 4% of the country's population reads English newspapers and watches English TV news channels. Still, a lot of resources are pumped into shaping the narrative on these English media because politicians and political parties ultimately realize that that message does trickle down. The fifth and final component is the actual election management. And that is what people think about as the election. That, okay, we are going to do booth management. We are going to make sure that there is a person at every booth. We are going to have a get out the vote campaign, because in India, it's extremely important to get voters out on the last day. Just that can shift 2 to 3% of the votes if one party is very active in getting their supporters out, while the other one's not as active. Then their supporters don't come out and vote as actively. So this is basically what a political campaigns entails. Now, how do political consultants fit into this framework? When it comes to on-ground intelligence and strategy building, professionals are slightly important in the sense that they do provide neutral feedback. They do collect issues more neutrally. Teams of young people, college educated, going out and surveying voters has shown to be a better method than political operatives and karyakartas going out and asking the same questions. People are more likely to be honest to say an outsider who's likely not even from that state than they are to a local political karyakarta that they know personally. So this helps. The second component of it is that someone needs to sift through the data. There is a lot of data that comes in about local issues, on-ground issues. We collect a lot of feedback on what people are voting based on. Say, if you look at the example of 2019, the vote was based on national issues of India versus Pakistan or Balakot or Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So if you ran a very on-ground campaign about the local candidates, it's unlikely to work, just because people aren't even thinking about the local candidate. They're voting based on something completely different. Similarly, there's a set of voter who votes based on religion. There's another set that votes based on caste and these different issues. So these characterizations and mapping is something that wasn't very actively done in Indian politics before the 2000s, even though politicians have been trying it for a really long time. And they used to actually sit with the voter roll and try to do this manually, but it wasn't a scalable process. So what happened was you had politicians doing it. You did not have political consultants, because for political consultants to exist, the process needs scalability. If I went to a local MP or MLA candidate and worked with just one, it probably wouldn't be a very feasible business model. But if I can do it at the state level, it becomes feasible to actually hire people from IITs and IIMs and this and the best colleges and universities from across the world and do it for the entire state. Ground cadre building is something that political parties themselves have to do, and political consultants aren't great at it. But what they have become great at is messaging the cadre and keeping them active. When it comes to assigning tasks to a political cadre, consultants have a way to essentially keep the cadre engaged. A lot of that work will not yield into electoral benefit for the party or the candidate, but at least they know that, okay, I can get through to my cadre when I require it. Building a volunteer network essentially is a combination of using communication strategies and using the on-ground intelligence. So again, political consultants become very useful here. One good part about this is that a lot of new issues do come out. This has made political manifestos actually quite specific in a lot of ways. Political parties now promise, okay, we are going to give smartphones to everyone. We are going to do this specific thing. We're going to build this many kilometers of roads. It's also because they want to, or we're going to give everyone jobs or pensions. It's because a volunteer network that cared about that specific issue was brought into the political campaign process. Social media and communication strategy, as Neelanjan talked about, involves a lot of micro-targeting on social media, classification of people into different buckets, who's likely to vote for me, which area should I be focusing on, what should be my key message. This essentially breaks down into a framework that I cover extensively in the second book, which is ON3C, which is the objective is set first, then the narrative that will help you serve that objective is decided. So the objective could be something like, okay, I don't want BJP to get any of the middle class votes. Then the narrative could be about unemployment, that no one's getting jobs. The second one could be about price rise, how everything's become so expensive. You sift down through this methodology. Once the objective is set, you go to the narrative, then you go to the context. Why is someone likely to believe it? Then you go to the campaign, that what am I going to do over the next 1.5 months to actually convince them? And that the last level is content. And that is when all of the fake news comes in, all of the dirtiness of it all comes in. But that is the last part. There is a lot that happens before it. Election management, again, political consultants become important here because they run war rooms. They make sure that people from the political party are there at the polling booth. They don't find these people. They actually have no capacity to find these people at the polling booths, but they ensure that the right person is there at the right booth. They ensure that, okay, the rickshaws reach where the voters are. They ensure that if there is a complaint coming in or a line is very slow, then they can escalate it to the election commission. So essentially, they professionalize the war room management that already existed. It isn't new. Quickly going to touch upon what data is there and what data is important. So Form 20 data, which essentially classifies how 100 to 800 to 1200 voters voted. So at a booth level, you know how people are voting in the previous elections, the previous Lok Sabha and the Assembly elections. Panchayat and ward data is essentially who contested local body elections, the different individuals who even lost. They are local influencers because they got 100 votes, 50 votes. So they are someone known in society. So you want to be able to get to them. Party membership and missed call data. Obviously, you have a list of party members with their phone numbers on there. BJP ran a huge missed call campaign. Now everyone runs a missed call campaign. It's essentially a data collection exercise on, okay, who can we get to support us on a specific issue or just support the party in general. There's field survey data, as we talked about, which gives you actionable insight from the ground and gets you to know what issues are important. Then there are focus group discussions that happen, which is essentially you call just people from the upper caste between 18 to 25, and you see how they are responding to specific messages. Then you call people from, say, 25 to 35 from the OBC community. You see how they are responding to certain messages. How are women responding? How are men responding? So you get this classification. Then a very important new thing is identification of local influencers. There are a lot of these like lawyers groups, businessmen group, caste community and religious organizations that exist and are active at the local level. So you want to know who these influencers are and what do they want. Can I fulfill their demand and get some votes because of it? So this is primarily the data that is collected. Obviously, a lot of it gets linked to phone numbers. A lot of it gets linked to other data sets for more accuracy, but this is the framework. Last point I would like to touch upon is it's not like any of this is new. Political parties have been doing it for a really long time, and local politicians have been great at it. Like I have met some people who've been winning elections for, say, since the 1960s and the 1970s. They've been like MPs and MLAs, and their families have been in politics since before independence. They had this data available to them. They had a mechanism to reach these voters. They had a mechanism to classify these voter base by hand. They do not require political consultants. But now when you look at the scenario, what has happened is all the messaging and all the elections are centrally run. The party runs them instead of a local candidate running them. In this scenario, all of this becoming scalable. That is, in my opinion, where political consultants come in. Localized election, if you look at, say, a municipal election, I don't think there is a single political consultant who's been very effective in any municipal election across the country or in any panchayat election, because it's literally 2,000 voters and the candidate knows the voters personally. He's lived there all his life. No one from the outside is going to have much impact. But when you look at a national narrative building exercise, a national messaging exercise, then the consultants become very relevant. So we'll take up more at the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you for this comment, Shivam. Very, very helpful from someone who's worked on the inside and can provide us detailed commentary on that. Our next speaker is Ruchi Gupta. She is founder and director of the Future of India Foundation, a nonpartisan foundation for big picture thinking on youth issues and political reform. She's a former national in charge of the Youth Congress, she's written as the largest progressive student union in the world, with more than 40 lakh registered members. She's written extensively on policy and political issues in all English language newspapers and journals, and is also an advisor with Samruddha Bharat Foundation, and co-editing a volume for the Foundation's Rethinking India series with Penguin. Before coming back to India, she was a consultant with McKinsey in New York City. Ruchi, take it away.
Thank you, Neelanjan, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me. This is a topic that I feel very strongly about, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak about it. I will make 4 points, and if there's time left over, I will add a couple of more points. Neelanjan, just let me know if there is time left over after I'm done. I think more than the issue of whether or not there are political consultants and whether we use data, the question is the depoliticization of political parties and centralization of power in political parties, which allows political consultants to become oversized and play an oversized role in campaign management. Political parties exist as intermediaries between the state and people. So of course, they must have a very strong feedback loop. The question is, how are they developing this feedback? Are they outsourcing this feedback to completely agnostic political consultants who come in at the last minute? Or are they getting this feedback from their own organization? As long as they're getting this feedback from their own organization, this feedback would be political and it would be contextualized. And if they're getting this feedback from completely outside, from an agnostic, ideologically agnostic individual, then the data would be a bit lacking context. I'll give you 2 examples. During the time of demonetization, survey was run, and people were asked, has demonetization inconvenienced you? And of course, people said, yes, it has inconvenienced us. What was taken away from that survey was that people are against demonetization. However, a politician would have then also asked the second question, even if people are feeling inconvenienced by demonetization, what is the perception of demonetization? Are they feeling like they have been enlisted by the Prime Minister in being part of some sort of a nation building effort, or are they feeling inconvenienced? Are they blaming the Prime Minister, even the minor local level corruptions? Are they thinking that the bank manager is somehow responsible for those inconveniences or those local corruptions? Or is the Prime Minister responsible because the policy itself is wrong? So these are the sorts of things which I feel that when you outsource and you look at data, data is not apolitical, data exists in a context. Data has to be presented, it has to be selected, how are the questions asked? So data, I mean, it's usually used as a very objective way that, well, data says this, but data never says anything. It's actually the person who is translating and interpreting the data who says something. It's really not just data. So if the political party, instead of getting this data or this feedback from their own internal organization, which is presumably organized around a certain point of view, a certain ideology, was to suddenly say that we will bring in someone from the outside who will give us this data, then that data is going to be very agnostic and may or may not fulfill the political party's needs. So the question is really not data, because of course, all political parties should need data. So for instance, you can use data to understand whether or not a certain welfare measure has actually covered the population. But how has that welfare measure been used? How has it been perceived? What are the problems? Those are not things that would necessarily come from data. That would require a certain amount of judgment, and that judgment, in my mind, should exist within the political party. The second point that I want to make is that political parties exist to promote a certain point of view, ideology, or a certain perception is, or a certain point of view is what political parties are supposed to propagate. But what I'm seeing is that data is being used somehow, and political consultants are being used to completely overturn this relationship. Political parties are not existing to mobilize opinion in a certain way. Somehow they're saying, okay, let's find out what people are thinking and then let's mirror what people are thinking. So as opposed to doing their job of mobilizing public opinion, political parties, most of the political parties, excepting maybe the BJP and the RSS, they are trying to just gauge what people are thinking and then trying and aligning their message around what people are thinking. And that's really not the job of political parties. Political parties are supposed to understand what people are thinking and then articulate the message in a manner that would be best suited to what people are thinking, their ability to understand. But they have to stick to their own message. They have to stick to their own ideology. But increasingly, political parties are starting to say, well, this is very popular, this is very unpopular, and then let's change our message altogether, which I think is very problematic. And that again points to how political parties are becoming depoliticized. And they are no longer propagating and they're no longer doing their job of mobilizing opinion around a certain way. The third point I want to make is that roughly we have about 5,000 MLAs and MPs in a country of 1.35 billion. But at the moment of slightest instability, we literally have to corral these people physically. You have to take their phones, you have to confiscate, you have to put them in some resort. And it's really, I mean, in 1.35 billion people, we are not able to elect, and parties are not able to give tickets to people, even 5,000 tickets, where people have integrity, where you don't have to physically, literally physically corral them in resorts before they start defecting to the other side for this or that reason. This shows that of the two things that political parties are supposed to do, one is to propagate a certain ideology, and two, for them to capture power. They've actually, the first role has completely atrophied, and it's only the latter where they want to capture power, and hence people that are coming to political parties are only coming to capture power. So this is why, because political parties are no longer political organizations, they're no longer existing to mobilize public opinion, which is why suddenly we see this rise of political consultants, this rise of data, because each of these things, to articulate what should be the strategy, to understand what the feedback is, to understand what the data would represent, each of these things could be actually done in-house. There's no reason whatsoever to have to outsource these tasks. But the reason we are having to outsource these tasks is because political parties are no longer doing their work of political mobilization. They're no longer propagating a certain ideology. They're just completely, they've become platforms to capture power. And because they become platforms to capture power, they become these fissiparous organizations, because everyone who has come in, there is absolutely no common ground in political parties anymore. Everyone who's coming in is only coming to capture power, not for a particular ideology, and which is why political consultants have developed this outsized role. I think we should also differentiate between political consultants for a local candidate and political consultants for political parties. Political consultants for a local candidate, I mean, that's completely fine. Local candidates may or may not have the wherewithal to professionalize all aspects of messaging, to be able to make certain kinds of creatives, to get the social media in place. That's totally fine for them to have some sort of a political consultant. And really, they don't have political consultants because they're not devising strategy. They're doing more of the logistical and outreach sort of work for an individual candidate. Where the problem comes in is where we have a political consultant who sits at the apex of the political party and then starts to bypass the organization completely, giving opinions and giving feedback. That I think is the real problem. And that when we talk about political consultants, I think it makes sense to really talk about political consultants at the level of the party and not individual candidates. Neelanjan, do I have more time? I just want to make a couple of more points.
Sure, maybe take a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. I want to make one point about the BJP and the RSS. BJP also hired PK, but just, I mean, look at the trajectory. The RSS was so reviled after Gandhi's assassination. I don't think there was an organization that was so marginalized, that was so reviled, it was banned. But the RSS never really gave up on their message. They mutated, they have opened up a bunch of new organizations, but they never really gave up on their own message. And we've seen that because they stuck to their message, because they stuck to their ideology, they are now sitting at the apex of a country, and pretty much the entire discourse has been now hijacked by the IRSS. Similarly, Prime Minister Modi, he after Gujarat 2002 elections, he was shunned by the media. He couldn't even get a US visa. But he never really changed his ideology. He did not change his message. He stuck to his message. He may have started talking about other things. He may have started talking about development. But it's not as if anyone who saw the Prime Minister or the CM at that time thought that he is a different person. He stuck to his message. And which is why within the BJP, because he stuck to his message, because he worked on his own message, his own organization, which is why the BJP and Mr. Modi in the BJP, they're sitting at the apex and they're pretty much controlling the discourse. All political parties are now talking about good Hindus, bad Hindus, Hindus should be at the forefront. So it's pretty much, we've really given up on the counter agenda altogether. And it's the RSS and the BJP agenda that's holding fort in India. And that's primarily because they stuck to their message. They may have hired Prashant Kishore, but Prashant Kishore never sat on their head. He was very much a political consultant who was giving them advice. But look at Prashant Kishore right now. Prashant Kishore is not providing feedback to parties. He's really become the intermediary between opposition parties. So this is a political consultant, but he's really playing a politician's role, this role of developing alliances, this role of getting the opposition together. Prashant Kishore has sort of gone and hijacked this political role altogether. So this is a difference between a political party sticking to their own message. Even if they hire political consultants, those political consultants are only providing a service to the political party. And political parties that just give up on their own message, the political consultant then starts giving advice and starts setting the agenda. And there, I think, is the biggest problem with this whole idea of a political consultant and data, the depoliticization of political parties. Thank you, Neelanjan.
Thank you, Ruchi, for those comments. I'm sure we'll take up much further in discussion. So we do have a number of questions, but I promise I'll get to them soon. What I want to do is have a small moderated discussion between our panelists and me before I open it up to the questions that have shown up on the floor. And what I'd like to encourage, although I'm going to initially address the question to a single person, I'd like to encourage the panelists to jump in as they feel is appropriate for the questions that we have. So, Amogh, I want to start with you. You do a very good job of describing how the increase of wealth and also in some sense influences from the outside in terms of looking at professional campaigns brought political consultants into India, especially in the 2000s. And as you mentioned, it starts with sort of this sort of younger generation of wealthy dynasts and political families who are hiring consultants for individualized campaigns. At the same time, I think Shivam and Ruchi brought up this sort of very important distinction between looking at campaigns and political families that have been doing this at the individual level and scaling these kinds of consultancies to the level of a political party or to the level of a state level campaign. And I was wondering if you could provide some color as to how and why you believe that happened. Why is it that today, when we think our primary sort of understanding of what political consultants are doing is not working on individual campaigns, but really working on state level campaigns and designing a communication strategy and so on and so forth? And again, I said, Ruchi and Shivam, please feel free to jump in after a moment.
Right. Thank you for that, Neelanjan. So you're quite right. And I do take seriously the distinction that Ruchi pointed out, that there is a distinction worth making between political consultants like Prashant Kishore, who work with the entire party and manage the strategy for an entire state, and versus political consultants who perhaps are only working in a handful of cherry-picked constituencies in different parts of the country. And this is precisely the point I was pointing towards when I said that in some ways PK is an outlier. And I think often focusing too much on Prashant Kishore and his organization detracts from understanding how the industry as a whole is working in India. Coming to the question on scalability, why that happened, I think it's important to realize that even though Prashant Kishore represents the moment when political consultants scale up and start managing the pan-party affairs, even then, I think it's important to realize that his association began with Narendra Modi on an individual level. We know for a fact that Prashant Kishore emerges as his right-hand man in Gandhinagar during his tenure as Gujarat Chief Minister at a moment when Amit Shah had been banished because of the ongoing cases against him. That's point number one. And the second point worth noting is that Prashant Kishore was working for Narendra Modi at a point much before he even became a prime ministerial candidate. So there is, of course, some sort of rumors, I've never found someone who could confirm this, that Prashant Kishore also helped him out in his 2012 Gujarat Chief Ministerial campaign. And there's good reason to believe that the Citizens for Accountable Governance, which is the earlier avatar of IPAC, which was formed as early as July 2013, which was 3 months before Prime Minister Narendra Modi was nominated as the party's official candidate, which I believe took place on 13 September 2013. Already this organization was underway, and already the groundwork was underway by a political consultant working with a particular legislator, here in this case Narendra Modi, on a one-to-one basis. And it's only once Modi becomes the prime ministerial candidate that gets scaled up. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think once Prashant Kishore really emerges on the scene and he really establishes his credentials, I think after that, there is a sort of an imitative effect on how other parties also want to replicate the strategy of hiring a political consultant to manage the party-wide strategy. Having said that, I want to go back to the point that I made earlier, that even now, the majority of political consultants in India are not in charge of party-wide strategy. They are still working with individual candidates. And I think that's something worth returning to. And while I do take Ruchi's point that there is something to be said about depoliticization, there's something to be said about how these big tier political consultants often lead to centralization of power within parties. I still think that the problem of political consultants working with one-off legislators itself should not be scoffed at. There are enough ethical and other sort of problems of depoliticization, even at that very micro individual level. So let me just say that, but maybe Ruchi and Shivam want to jump in.
Either of you want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in mostly because I disagree with a lot of it for a couple of reasons. Like I've worked with a lot of these people. I know a lot of these people personally. So for one, IPAC is a company that provides political consultancy services, but Prashant is not just a political consultant, and he's been very honest about it. He has been wanting to become a political entity ever since 2014. That's literally why the rift within BJP happened. He joined the Janata Dal United in Bihar officially, became a party post holder. He's tried to get a governance role in West Bengal. So he's very actively wanted to be a political figure. Like right now, there were several rumors that he wanted to officially join the Congress party as actually the organizational general secretary, which didn't pan out. But him as an individual versus political consultancy as a field and political consultants in general are very separate things. So if one person, if say I have political ambitions and I give political statements and create a brand and image for myself, that does not represent political consultancy in any way whatsoever. The second component that I disagreed with is political consultants actually changing the stances and ideologies of political parties, mostly because I have not seen a single example of it happen. A lot of the on-ground data does help them shape their message, but I've not seen a party say move from like the left wing to the right wing or completely change their ideology just because it showed up in a survey result. Every party is largely where they were. BJP is the same as it was before. Congress ideologically is pretty much the same as where it was before. Mamata Banerjee is the same as where she was before. The campaign messaging ecosystem and the strategy building is for how to get your message across or how to shape it better, or if there is a specific issue that needs to be taken up more aggressively and some issue needs to be dropped altogether because it's not resonating. But at an ideological level, I have not seen political consultants shape a party that way.
Ruchi, I think you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick point about the ideology. I don't think that parties move left to right or right to left. What happens is, for instance, what we are seeing now in all election campaigns, every single political party uses the levers of the state to say we will give you XYZ benefit. So that economic largesse is a very apolitical way, and it's a very non-ideological way of harnessing voters. And that is what political consultants have done. Prashant Kishore has this format which almost all political parties have now started adopting, that there is one presidential face, and then that presidential face says that if I become the CM of the state, I'm going to give you XYZ benefits from the state, but that does not represent ideology. I can be giving X amount of money to women, whether I'm from the Congress party or whether I'm from the BJP, that has absolutely no ideology involved. So that's the first point. The second point that I was making is that political parties, because they've become depoliticized, now Congress party is very secular, but even now I can see that all political parties have suddenly started trumping up this Hindutva, hyper nationalism, which is certainly not part of Congress party's ideology. Congress party's ideology has been India belongs to all Indians. It is not that India now belongs to good Hindus. And that is exactly what we are seeing now, because suddenly we are seeing that Hindus have become very important. And of course, no political party should align itself against the majority community. But it's one thing to say that we are not against Hindus and to do various other things to align yourself with Hindus. And it's quite another to say that India now belongs to good Hindus. So essentially, you're conceding the RSS point that India belongs to good Hindus or a certain kind of Hindu, as opposed to holding the bare minimum line, which is that India belongs to all Indians and Indians are those people who are born in India. So this is what I mean by political parties becoming depoliticized, because they're no longer able to hold a non-negotiable line, in which I think Prashant Kishore and all these other people are simply, there's a dialectical relationship. It's not as if Prashant Kishore has come and said this line, but there is a dialectical relationship where political parties have already become depoliticized. And then a political consultant comes in at the last minute. And of course, because he's coming in at the last minute, he's only going to be able to use the levers of the state to be able to make his point that I will give you XYZ from the state. Because you have not been there as part of the organization. If you were there as part of the organization, you would then have mobilized your constituency based on what your organizational stand and your organization's ideology is. Because you don't have that, because your organization is not constructed along an ideological line, which is why you have to then go down these things of, I will give you X, I will give you 1,000 rupees, I will give you something, I will give you something, all from the levers of the state. That's not what a political party's job is.
I'm sorry, I have to jump in for one sec, because this entire largesse thing is much older than any political consultant is. You look at Amma canteens, you look at farm loan waivers, you look at the public distribution system, you look at saris being distributed by political parties with state money. These things are much older than any political consultant.
I think I would have to also sort of agree with Shivam there. I think the idea of personalization and largesse is older. I do take Ruchi's point that there is a dialectical relationship. This was already existing in political parties, and maybe political consultants have given it a further boost. So I'm willing to concede that point, but I don't think consultants by themselves brought this in.
So that's not what I'm saying at all.
Yeah.
Sorry, I want to clarify. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that because political parties were depoliticized already, which is why we have now suddenly brought these political consultants in. So I'm not making the point that it's Prashant Kishore or political consultants who have led to largesse, but that this represents a depoliticization of political parties. Sorry, Amogh, I just wanted to clarify that.
No, that's fine. And I would sort of agree with that modified point, of course.
I know there are a lot of questions. I'll just probably ask one more question to the panelists. I see there are a lot of questions out there. So I think that will take us through, through the rest of the time. So I just wanted to sort of pick up on something that Amogh mentioned, which I think in some ways gets to the heart of what some of the discussion that we've been having, right? Which is that even at the individual level, consultants are often doing very structural tasks, right? It need not be an ideological task, right? And often it isn't, right? Now that's actually very different than the way in which consultants and consultancies often work in other contexts. In many cases, consultancies are actually ideology and party specific, right? And I'm wondering first, why do we see consultants without that kind of specialization at all? Because it's actually quite rare outside of India. And secondly, if that is the case, that we're seeing this kind of non-specialized manner of consultant, right? What does it say about the future of this kind of model surviving? Are we in a world where the eventual equilibrium will be that there will be consultants that are assigned to ideology, Hindu nationalist, communist, so on and so forth, and party, right? Congress, TMC, BJP, or is it going to be the kind of free-for-all that we associate with the consultant space today? What sort of future do we have in front of us with respect to political consultants? And do we imagine that there are forks in the road that will change which direction that we go? Maybe let me start with Shiv.
Sorry,
yeah, why don't you go with Amogh? Why don't you, Shivam, why don't you take us, take this first?
So looking at the way it's headed, almost every political party will bring in most of the things in-house. It makes sense for them to do so because also hiring external people to do a lot of it is a big data security risk, because these political consultants do get access to your entire party membership database, every campaign that you've ever ran, who's done the missed call, what exactly people are you targeting through the schemes. So the political consultants get access to this data. Because it's just been less than a decade right now, no political consultant has actively been shown to take data from one political party and use it for like exactly the opposite political party. But I guarantee you this will happen, and everyone is going to realize how big of a problem this is. At that point of time, every party will definitely move it in-house. BJP, for the most part, has already moved it in-house. It is a company, but it's a company that is essentially a BJP like enterprise. It's like a PSU of the BJP. This is a model that a lot of other parties are also going to have to adapt. One part of the future. The second part of the future is we are going through a weak point for most political parties right now. That's why you see the decline in ideology. It's not particularly because of consultants or anything. Once the parties do find a foothold and they find a stronghold, then they will push a lot of political consultants out who themselves become political figures and political voices. That inevitably will happen. So that's my take on the future of this.
Amogh, you want to jump in?
Sure. I'll quickly respond to both the points that Neelanjan, that you brought up, and also to what just Shivam said. Firstly, I think, Neelanjan, you're completely right in drawing this to attention that compared to how political consultants work in the West, in India, it's a different ballgame when it comes to partisanship. So there was a study, which is roughly a decade old by now, by a scholar called David Dulio. It's a book called For Better or For Worse, which is a study of American political consultants. And David Dulio conducts a survey of American political consultants and asks them a whole range of questions. And he finds, to my surprise, that 90% of all American political consultants are committedly either Republican or Democrats. There's roughly a 10% which is floating in their sort of cross-party lines. But in US, which is as polarized as it can be, you find a situation where they might choose to work for one Democratic candidate's primary or another, but they don't cross party lines, 90% of them. Whereas in India, whether it's PK or whether it's some of the folks who I was studying who emerged much before PK, they from the get-go are working across party lines. One election they're with the SP, the other election they're with the candidate in the Congress, another election they're working with a candidate in the BJP and UP, and so on and so forth. And I think this is a very important distinction to keep in mind. And why this is happening, I think there are two reasons. From a structural point of view, I think it has to do with the fact that India is a multi-party system, even though at a state level, we know it works as a system of what is called multiple bipolarities, which is to say that often two parties are often in competition at the state level. But at the all India level, India is a multi-party system, or was in the 2000s and the 2010s. And there, of course, there isn't a dearth of parties or political consultants to move between. So in one very obvious sense, there are enough parties to go about that the demand for these services is forthcoming. The second reason why I think there is lack of filiality and there's lack of partisanship amongst political consultants has to do with the final point that I ended my opening remarks on, which is that we need to keep in mind the kind of political culture that these consultants come with. And one thing that I have found quite interesting when I have interviewed many of them during my fieldwork is that they say that we don't believe in partisanship. Forget our work as political consultants, even at the level of voters, we do not believe in party loyalty. And we believe in having a strong leader. We often look at the chief ministerial candidate, the prime ministerial candidate, but that is what we base our voting decisions on. And thus, even in their working lives, I'm quite amazed to find that their drive to work for a particular campaign has nothing to do with what party that candidate belongs to. But often they'll see their loyalty to the person who's really footing the bill, and they're really hedging their bets behind what they believe is the personality that the person is offering. Just one quick point before I move on to something that Shivam said. You might remember that, of course, Prashant Kishore has handled Jagan Mohan Reddy's campaign. A few years back, when the first time this story broke, I think News Minute had carried a story which said Jagan has hired PK and IPAC for a figure of 100 something crores. And Prashant Kishore had, and it was either Prashant Kishore, it was, I think, IPAC's Twitter handle, which had tweeted back saying, what is the point of us being hired? We don't sell our services to the candidate. We only work with that candidate who we believe is the most cleanest candidate, who can offer the most visionary leadership. And here, of course, we don't need to buy into this discourse and take it at its face level. But I do think such sort of proclamations do provide a very interesting entry point into the worldview of these political consultants, that they do not have loyalties to the parties. They are much more interested in working with the direct personality of the candidates that they're supposedly representing. And then of course, I would hazard to put too fine a point on it and guess about what the industry will look like in the future. But I do think that this is not something that's going to die away. I think we will see Indian political consultants quickly and fastly moving across party lines. This is not something that I think is going to go away anytime soon. The final point I will make before I would love to hear from Ruchi is that I do agree with Shivam that parties will try to build in-house capacities, but I really don't see in-house capacity as a substitute for political consultants. When I think about the professionalization of Indian politics, I think of them as two parallel tracks that are happening at the same time. There is a story of internal professionalization, where parties have invested in data analytics cells, research departments, social media cells, and that is happening side by side with certain tasks being outsourced to political consultants. And this happens precisely because even as parties are developing in-house capacities, as let's say the Congress did with its Shakti platform, its data analytics wing, which came up in the 2019 elections, a lot of that was not shared with your regular MP who was fighting the election in different parts of the country. A lot of the insight that perhaps came out of the Shakti platform, I think, to the best of my knowledge, was the insights from that data was only restricted to a very tiny party elites. Hence, at the individual constituency level, you will continue to find a situation where consultants are hired more and more, because the party leaders are certainly not sharing this data that they're sourcing from in-house capabilities with all their MPs and MLAs. So that's my basic point there.
Ruchi, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to make a small point, which builds on my earlier point. Mostly political consultants come at the time of election. It's not as if politicians hire consultants on an ongoing basis to run their parties. And at the time of election, if we look at the election primarily as a logistical exercise, that we need to get a certain amount of data, we need to do a certain kind of outreach, we need to have a certain amount of messaging, it all needs to be streamlined, we need to do certain meetings, we need to mobilize people to come to those meetings. In that purely logistical exercise, where we need to put up some X number of posters, there you can have any old political consultant come in. They can be completely ideologically agnostic because they're not providing an ideological service. However, if you were to see an election as an ideological contest, which it should be, but it isn't, then of course a political consultant being ideologically agnostic and going left, right, jumping between political parties would become very problematic. The problem is the reason political parties are not able to put their foot down is because they have actually not really worked throughout their term to be able to figure out how to mobilize, and because they wait until the last minute. Just political parties, last minute, they launch some campaign saying, You tell us what should be in the manifesto. It's a job of political parties to know what people want, for them to be sussing out what people want, their aspirations, their context, their grievances throughout their 5 years. So last minute at the time of the campaign, they launch, you tell us what you want in the manifesto. And then this big exercise is done where people then go collecting suggestions. It's ridiculous. Because the political party's campaign should be, this is what we are going to offer to you, not you come and tell us what you want. But this just shows that political parties have become so apolitical that this logistical exercise then becomes a campaign. And because the exercise is logistical and not ideological, then political consultants are able to play a role, which otherwise they would be completely marginalized and put to the side. The last point I want to make is on the professionalization of political parties. Political parties are not supposed to be professional. There should be a certain amount of professional competence, but political parties are not professional in the sense that any spokesperson, today you're sitting in Congress party and you're saying something, tomorrow you're going to jump to another party and you're going to say something. Your job as a spokesperson is not to be a professional. Your job is to articulate the party's ideology. But what is happening is that political parties are becoming so professionalized that the job is like a banker. You can be a banker in this bank, you can be a banker in that bank, you can be a spokesperson here, you can be a spokesperson there. And that's not the job of a political party. You should have a profession, you should be professionally competent, but you should not be a professional. Political parties exist to propagate a certain ideology. All the people who come together, they're supposed to collaborate. It's a platform to collaborate on a certain ideology, to propagate a certain ideology. So this idea that political parties should be professionalized and that roles can be outsourced to people, to me just seems like a really ridiculous proposition. They should be competent, professionally competent, but that's it. They very much should be, they should have filiality to their own ideology. That's the only thing that gives a political party credibility. And that's the last point. I've taken up a lot of time. That's the reason why we're seeing complete comedians come out of the blue and then they suddenly become somehow electable and they become leaders of the party. That makes no sense. We've seen, which is that country, Italy, just a complete comedian will come out of the blue because political parties have lost credibility so thoroughly that a comedian can go on to win an election. In India, a comedian can just come out of the blue and then go on to become the leader of the party. It's ridiculous. It's just completely ridiculous. The whole proposition is ridiculous. So I'm sorry, I got quite carried away.
I'm going to jump in here, and by the way, maybe we're going to see more comedians into politics as it's becoming more and more difficult to practice comedy in India. But and by the way, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, or was he the President or the Prime Minister of Ukraine, is actually a professional comedian.
Okay, let me follow. What's his name? I'm forgetting.
Beppe Grillo in Italy. But there's a number of questions asked by members of the audience, and I really would like to attract your attention to it. You have access to the Q&A, but I'm going to sort of summarize and club some of these questions. So Lipika has a number of questions to Amogh, essentially on what do you see, behind this sort of new calling, to become a political consultant? Is it's just, it's a booming industry, it's a mushrooming industry, and therefore, it generates opportunities that attract a lot of people, or is there something more to it, a persona of the political consultant that drives, young people to get into that? And also similarly, we've seen, and it's come through the conversation, that there's no firewall that's really effective between consultant and actual political actors, right? And there's a lot of back and forth. Prashant Kishore is maybe an exceptional figure, in that regard. But do political consultants also, become themselves actors of electoral campaign in their own way? And is this something that voters become, aware and sensitive about? So maybe Amogh, you can start, with these questions, and then maybe I'll channel a couple of other questions.
Right. So the question of why people become political consultants, I have found in my own research that some of the initial people who were attracted to this industry were attracted for one reason, which I've already pointed out, which is this wave of entrepreneurialism, which is very much in there in the 2000s, start your own business. And this was one industry which was very much seemed inviting at that point. The other important reason, which I think we should not diminish, is that people who become political consultants are usually belong to a socioeconomic category of the country, which is fairly well off, middle class, upwardly mobile elites. And this is a class which has historically, we have been told, vacated the space of electoral politics because they felt that politics has become too criminal, it has become too dirty. And with the mentalization of politics, there was a growing belief amongst this class of voters that politics doesn't have any space for people like them. And I find that a lot of people who are becoming political consultants belong to that section of citizenry, which comes in with this disposition, that they can't go out in the hustle bustle of politics. They can't be street fighters. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the right caste or political capital to become political leaders. Hence, they would rather approach and carve out a niche for themselves in politics by leveraging what they do best, which is understanding data with their managerial technical skills. And that's how they feel that they can carve out a niche for themselves within politics, not by being street agitators, but by this sort of a technocratic managerial way of intervening in politics. So that is, I think, one of the major reasons why people are becoming political consultants. It's a way of engaging in politics, but keeping politics at an arm's length, which sort of suits their own particular dispositions. On the second point, I would say I have very little to say, and this is something I'm hoping to work in the future, whether voters know that a politician has hired a political consultant, how do they evaluate such a politician, and how voters view political consultants. So that I don't have much to say about that right now, but it's certainly a question that I think about quite a lot, and hopefully I'll have the chance to work on it in the future. Maybe Ruchi and Shivam have some insights into that.
Okay. There's a question from Akshit Chola, which I'm going to direct to Shivam. So we understand that political consultants and people who work for political consultancies come with a set of technical skills, but at the roots of data collection, well, there is data collection. So how much effort is put to actually train surveyors, those who actually the grassroots work, and how do we ensure that the information that gets channeled is reliable?
So that is probably one of the toughest part of surveying in India, to actually train surveyors and then to assure that they actually went out and surveyed people instead of just filling the form themselves. So you end up establishing call centers who end up calling the people that the way to ask how many questions were asked to you. There's an entire verification process that happens. But on the whole, yes, we do try to train people. One who's done any survey really tries to train people. Not effective for all the people that you end up training. There are still a lot of people who are not great surveyors who end up being hired and going out onto the field. But yeah, that is always the attempt.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Just looking. Yeah, there's an interesting question from an anonymous attendee, is that, you have different models, obviously, of political, consultancies. Some are very some basically operate in the dark and very, backroom operation, and others play actually a very visible role to the point that they actually become even actors of campaign. Do you have a sense of what model is more effective? What may be, the advantages or disadvantages of both respectable models? And then there's another question for Ruchi regarding, parties' ideology. Political parties in India have been described in the literature and popularly as, being fairly ideologically agnostic, or where the ideology was always sort of subsumed under a cloud of pragmatism and opportunism. And you can multiply historical examples across, political parties of parties contradicting the core tenets or the core values they claim to adhere for the sake of short-term electoral efficacy. And so where is the turning point, happening through the intrusion or the involvement of political consultants?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question, Jill. What do you mean by where is the,
So,
what is the point?
so you make the argument that there is a depoliticization of political parties and that campaigns are sort of emptied from any sort of ideological content because they run as very, pragmatic operations and very logistical operations. But at the same time, I mean, even before, consultants emerged, there was a view that Indian political parties were best described by their opportunism and pragmatism rather than by, their adhesion to an ideological core. And so the question, I suppose, is, does that attenuate sort of your argument, or is that a characterization of parties before PC that you would agree with?
Right. So I already sort of said that, political consultants and depoliticization of parties, they're in a dialectical relationship. The reason political consultants could make inroads is because political parties had become very apolitical to begin with. However, somewhere I also made the point that there is one political party and an entity, the RSS and the BJP, who have actually remained fairly consistent in their ideology, and they have remained on message. And it is because they have actually been very ideological that they have been able to shift the discourse to the right so comprehensively. Even though they had been so marginalized after Gandhi's assassination, for the RSS to be able to make a comeback after Gandhi's assassination, for the Prime Minister to be able to make a comeback after 2002, and I mean, this is quite remarkable. And they've made a comeback not by saying that we disagree with what we were doing earlier, not by disowning their past, but by very much owning their past, right? So that just shows that ultimately ideology does win. And all political parties, the entire opposition is now pretty much playing on their agenda. We are trying to sort of, nuance within that agenda. But we are pretty much playing on the RSS and BJP's agenda because BJP has stuck to message and the other opposition parties haven't. So to conclude, I don't think that political parties in India necessarily need to be apolitical. We've seen that the one party that has been very political, that has been very ideological, has actually reaped great benefit from it, electoral benefit from it. So any political party that's thinking that we should completely give up our ideology, start playing on BJP's agenda, and that will somehow bring us back to power, I am very skeptical. I don't know if that's really the way forward at all.
No, in fact, I'm very much ill at ease with this notion that you can actually separate ideology, entirely from party and electoral politics, because, and I don't remember if it was Amogh or Shivam who mentioned that, but even those political consultants work on the basis of a number of assumptions. They claim to being basically a technocratic addition to electioneering. They claim that their solutions are very pragmatic and try to maximize, return, for political parties. But they do work on the basis of normative assumption. One, that you need a strong leader, and that it need to be a strong leader of the CEO kind. And so there is a particular political vision which lies behind the technocratic discourse, the pragmatism, the tech-enhanced solutions, displayed by political consultants, which is very much there, and which very much has an impact on political parties, especially since, as was mentioned by you, Ruchi, political campaigns become more and more homogenized. Right, it's a set of solution that political parties sort of apply. They sort of replicate the formula that seem to have worked for others, and that's, to my mind, nefarious for the necessary diversity that we need to have. Right, there has to be democratic choice. It cannot just be the one who will subsidize pilgrimage is, the most. There has to be more, diversity to offer than that. There are some specific questions about specific campaigns, like the Bihar Vikas mission in Bihar, which did not, really work. Shivam, perhaps do you have any, views on this? And then Amogh, you wanted to raise.
So Bihar Vikas Mission isn't a political campaign. It was what Prashant Kishore tried to build after Nitish Kumar came to power. So he got the rank of a cabinet minister to create a body that would work on governance issues, but clearly realized very fast that you can be a political operative, but that doesn't place within a political party to do like governance work, completely separate things. I've not seen the actual question. Actually.
Yeah. Amogh?
Yeah, Jill, I just want to return to the point that you were making right before this. And I just want to thank you for putting into words what I think I was trying to get at. But I think you did a far better job at that, which is to say that these people who come in by saying that we don't believe in party loyalty, that partisanship has no role, let's look at clean leaders, we need CEO like prime ministers and chief ministers. You're extremely right. That exactly is the ideological project. So I think on the one hand, there is a language that, let's depoliticize, just let's only look at data. But that at the heart of it is extremely political project, which is to think about politics in this quantitative sense, shown of all sort of normative visions. And let me provide a quick example of that. In the 2017 UP elections, we of course know Prashant Kishore for a certain point of time was advising the Congress party and working very closely with Rahul Gandhi. And then of course we know, and this was widely reported in the press, this is not my personal opinion, it is widely known that Prashant Kishore advised to the Congress party that they needed to bring in a Brahmin chief minister as face. And this is one of the reasons why Sheila Dikshit was brought in as the supposed chief ministerial candidate at that point of time. And this again goes to show that, you're claiming to put forward a suggestion because supposedly that's something emerging value-free from the data, but that's certainly not true. Absent from the entire discussion is a normative discussion of what does caste mean in UP politics. Do you really need an upper caste face? Maybe to win an election, but what does that mean about politics as a whole in UP and having a vision for UP? And that's one point. And similarly, I think going back to the point that Ruchi made quite early, sure, there is a tendency to throw freebies and throw largesse at voters and try to appeal to them in that way. But I've actually found that the people who work in IPAC are actually far more fiscally conservative. They actually would hate to work for a chief ministerial candidate or a prime ministerial candidate who are actually using these so-called populist techniques. Thus, it's no surprise that in 2014, a whole bunch of people who first joined Citizens for Accountable Governance, which is the organization that Prashant Kishore had floated, believed and come up with slogans such as maximum governance, minimum government. So often, I think it'd be slightly easy to claim that they're moving towards any sort of ideology as long as the data speaks. It is at the heart of it as a very depoliticized notion of what politics should be, which has very little space for any sort of normative value judgments.
No, absolutely. We're running short of time, but there are also questions in the chat box which I have overlooked. And yeah, there's a question. Ankita has a nice question on issues of moral and privacy issue related to data. So we know that there's very little regulation on the use of data, particularly political data in the country by institutions themselves, but even more so by private actors. And so maybe I could take one quick comment on the three of you as also a form of conclusion on precisely on those aspects: data protection, privacy protection, and how safe is are these data once they are collected, because I would imagine that it's pretty easy to export data from one campaign to another, eventually from one party to another, and so forth. So maybe Shivam, you want to start on.
Unfortunately, data protection is quite terrible in India. A lot of data does get sold on the gray market and gets linked to electoral rules. Phone numbers are also not covered, so it allows you to message people directly after you've segmented them into categories. So all of these problems exist. Issue now, though, is that with the personal data protection bill coming in, a lot of selective targeting of private parties who use data can be done, except the government itself is exempt from almost all data regulation even right now. and anyone who works for the government might not be prosecuted for data. This creates an even more unlevel playing field where one party has access to tremendous amount of data on voters and the other party has no access to any of the voter data. Makes messaging difficult, makes decision making around politics difficult, makes making your ideology reach the voters very difficult. So these issues will come up. WhatsApp regulation change is a great example of this because BJP had created WhatsApp groups before the new rules came in. Other parties tried to create it after 2018, except it was impossible to do at scale because WhatsApp changed the regulation. So the competitive advantage over there is now built in. So all of these issues very tricky. Essentially, we should have acted on it much sooner. Now it's become much more complicated to address.
Yeah, there's a gentleman once who tried to sell me TCPD data. It was quite concerning and amusing at the same time. All right, we are running short. We have run short of time 4 minutes ago, but I really want to thank all of you for participating in this important discussion, and good to see that, you know, for once we had, you know, some disagreement and actual debate. So I'm grateful for that too. A special thanks to Neelanjan, who I hope will be able to catch up some sleep from the West Coast, and yes, and until the next time that we meet. Thank you to members of the audience, and stay tuned with the CPR-TCPD dialogues in Indian politics, which shall continue.
Thank
you, everybody.
Take care of everyone. Be safe.